Aardman Animation. Now this is a studio that is near and dear to my heart, not just because it is legitimately near in vicinity sometimes, but this of course is the mostly stop-motion British animation studio, and today we are doing a deep dive into all of the Aardman movies, ranking them from worst to best. These guys have been going for almost 50 years now, which means we've got a lot of ground to cover. Started in a small studio in Bristol, Aardman has given us all-time greats like Chicken Run, Wallace and Gromit, Arthur Christmas, and, as we'll learn, so much more. These guys are the GOATs of British animation, mainly because there's not many British animation houses in the first place, but they're legendary nonetheless. They have respect from across the industry as well, from Pixar to The Simpsons to Steven Spielberg and even Hayao Miyazaki. The plucky little studio from Bristol is world-renowned, which is why, as the guy most of you probably just know as the British dude who covers animation, I thought it was time I went through and ranked the Aardman movies. However, before we get cracking, I have some disclaimers. I am going to be going through all the major Aardman releases. That means that, as well as all the feature-length films, I will be including the short films as well. However, that does not mean every short film, alright? For example, anything pre-1989 is basically off the table. I'm not gonna go back through hundreds of 2-minute clips of Morph. I'm a busy boy, and this video is gonna be taking long enough as it is. I'm talking all of the Wallace and Gromit stuff of varying length, and yes, the original Creature Comforts. I consider the later stuff more of a TV series of sorts anyway, so sorry. That's also a good point to mention, actually, that Aardman TV series are also excluded from this list. Sean's got 2 feature-length movies, so he'll be fine. So, with all of that cleared up, at the bottom of our list is, of course, Aardman, the first ever massive Aardman disappointment. And I'm just gonna say it, this is literally just Space Jam with cavemen and soccer. Yeah, somehow Aardman managed to rip off Space Jam of all the movies. And honestly, I'm afraid Space Jam is just better. I'm not a crazy Space Jam apologist, I don't think it's that great. I just have a lot of nostalgia for it, which I think says a lot about my thoughts on Early Man as well. On this occasion, the version of this story that is Bugs Bunny is the one that I actually prefer. The Eddie Redmayne caveman just wasn't it for me. This one also failed to bring in much money, and I mean big time it didn't make money. It only made $54.6 million worldwide on a $50 million budget. For context, Flushed Away was their biggest flop before this, and that still made $178 million in the positive. So Early Man did bad big time. As with every Aardman production, the claymation itself is spectacular, and you get to see a new level of ambition from the Aardman team, presuming there was a decent budget behind this. Not to mention, it has the imagination of Aardman legend Nick Park behind this, which I think is why this is so disappointing. The guy is an absolute legend and seems like a grounded, wholesome person in the interviews I can find, so it's a shame to have to admit that this one just was a dud. But a dud it was. With Aardman movies, you expect a certain level of frenetic, snappy British humor, you know, and a laugh a minute. This just wasn't. They should have really got some solid comedy writers in to punch up the script a little bit, because this could have been something really special with the premise that it was playing with. And when do you ever see football actually called football in movies these days? The Americans ruined it for all of us. Not to mention the other elements, you know, the Stone Age versus the Iron Age is realized in such an abstract and imaginative way that it's a shame that the plot then just collapses into a football match anyway. And as I've discussed before, there is not really that much entertainment value in a fictional, predestined sports game. The whole point of sport is the real-life spontaneity of it, you know? England recently learned that very clearly. The outcome of a game isn't something that a writer has predetermined, and try however much you want, I tend to find any sports portrayed in movies incredibly boring. Yes, even more so than the real thing. Add in the fact that you're watching a bunch of plasticine cavemen playing the game, and that is a part of the plot that the movie wants to emotionally invest in, and oh dearie me, you know? I genuinely can't believe that this soccer match is the best that they had for the climax of the film. This movie was born out of 10 years of problems as well. For those who haven't seen our video on it, Early Man is in many ways one of the original versions of DreamWorks' The Croods. Under the working title back then of Crude Awakening, suddenly the title of that movie makes more sense, the movie was originally part of the deal between DreamWorks and Aardman and would have been co-written by none other than John Cleese. However, when the studios parted ways, DreamWorks took the project with them, and from the looks of things, Aardman was left with some amazing concept art. However, unfortunately, this is the one time the amazing animation couldn't save a mediocre movie. So following up on that, we have Chicken Run: Dawn of the Nugget. Yeah, we're going there already. Their most recent is their second worst, so I say, this was the most 2010s Pixar sequel era that Aardman's gone for so far. You know what I mean? It was a safe, mildly funny, clean-looking follow-up to the original movie. I say mildly, there are some very funny jokes in this, credit where it's due. The gag about having someone have to manually operate a high-tech eye scanner was a particular favorite of mine. Not to mention the summoning of the chicken to go up the escalator to be slaughtered into nuggets showed some element of edge and dark humor had actually carried over. However, I genuinely think that clean is the word I would use for this sequel. In the original Chicken Run, there was a real grit to its look, The aim of making a chicken farm look like a prisoner of war camp really came across in the atmosphere they created. In this one, I had to seriously consider turning down my screen saturation down because my god does this movie have a bright color palette nonetheless. Everything is pristine, there's high definition movement and execution, which just isn't the vibe of Chicken Run for me. Whilst I like the black comedy of the death in the sequel, the original used its death as a real gut punch. Just a straight up cold moment that established the threat. I even did a full-on scene breakdown that I was so enamored by that scene, as much as it also traumatized me and I didn't watch it for another 15 years. In this one, you could see the threat throughout, but you can't feel it, Tweety on a gritty, mud-trodden farm is terrifying. This woman will crawl through the mud to get you and slaughter you for food. Tweety in a high-tech James Bond supervillain base is silly, but not in the usual Aardman silly. Dare I say, it's too silly to really be threatened by her. It's very much Chicken Run with a child lock on. And considering the protagonist is the young daughter of Ginger and Rocky, you have to wonder whether this was the idea. It's the same mistake made time and time again of people have wanted this sequel for years, so we'll make it and gear it primarily to the new generation that haven't specifically asked for it. They even recast the two leads with younger, more relevant talent, which really didn't serve them well in the UK press. I can see why Mel Gibson may be a bit controversial nowadays, but saying publicly that Julia Sawalha sounds too old for the role wasn't your finest hour. As for the film itself, they just feel entirely different to the characters from the original, even though they do literally try to repeat some of their most memeified lines. Timothy Spall's still around, you couldn't have used him. And if you were worried about Julia Sawalha not sounding like herself anymore, then interesting choice to chuck in Thandie Newton. My conspiracy theory is that they recast a load of people at once to make it look less awkward that they weren't bringing back Mel Gibson for reasons. Anyway, this is overall fine, but I'm not sure fine was quite the ticket for a follow-up to Chicken Run. But it does say something great for the studio if their second worst movie is fine, They're not a terrible studio that makes terrible movies. Though I would be up for doing a tier list of one of those one day. Next up, Robin. So yeah, let's very quickly get on to the good stuff. They haven't really made a lot of bad movies, though a bit worrying that the two worst are both fairly recent. Maybe the studio is going downhill. Now, this is technically the first movie of the Netflix-produced Aardman era, and to be fair, it's a cute enough holiday special. It doesn't reinvent the wheel story-wise, but I do like how it looks completely different to anything else Aardman has ever done. Considering we've had all sorts of scenarios where studios have just stuck with the same art style again and again and again for all eternity's sake, it is nice to see a studio, even though it's a little more underground, having the freedom to make more variations and take more interesting dives, It's always in some way pushing the animation industry into new directions, so it's always nice to see that even an underdog like Aardman is up for doing something different every now and again. Gone are the trademark big mouths and gapless eyes. This looks like a children's picture book brought to life through felt materials, and I am really a big fan of how this looks. As someone who's a big fan of video games like Paper Mario and Pikmin, seeing that kind of real materials incorporated into another world is just so satisfying to witness, in a lot of ways. And I would be excited to see Aardman do more stop-motion projects that drift away from their house style. As much as I call this studio an underdog, it's also probably the biggest stop-motion studio, It's a giant of its own niche, and they definitely would have the, actual freedom financially to make those kind of interesting, more diverse directorial choices in future. I mean, going back to the video game thing, if Nintendo is looking to make more video game adaptations with Mario with Illumination and Zelda with somebody else in in live action, I would love to see a Pikmin movie done in the Aardman style, but felt, physical, stop motion, craft work, you know? Now with Robin, they've also got some decent voice talent, including Gillian Anderson as an evil cat, which is very nice, but apparently she has to be in every Netflix project now. I don't know how they got me to invest in a Robin that thinks it's a mouse, but here we are. It's cute, it's simple, it plays like a 30-minute Christmas card. Make more stuff like this, Aardman. It's a nice breath of fresh air. And definitely a fan favorite for me over something like a Bleach Chicken Run sequel, you know? I wonder if they will make a third one of those. Moving up a bit, we have Shaun the Sheep Farmageddon. The absolute audacity of Aardman to make the second Shaun of the Sheep movie this. Usually the point where a movie or series suddenly snaps to, so, aliens is usually a complete jump the shark disaster, you know, usually waiting for movie number 5. Not the case here. It's not perfect, but it's nonetheless delightful. Among many other things, it basically has Shaun go through a whole E.T. type arc. Although the alien design itself is something I'm torn on. On one hand, no other alien design looks like this, so it's very original and, dare I say, very alien. On the other hand, it may sacrifice some of its alienness to look cute for kids. Makes sense, but you know, still a bit of a 50-50. It's not the most important thing, but just my observation. It also has that trademark Shaun the Sheep charm of telling the story entirely through visuals and sounds. There's a reason why Shaun and Mr. Bean both travel well internationally, and that's a distinctive lack of a language barrier. Not to mention accessibility for deaf and non-verbal viewers. With a bit of silly humor and a story that's easy to follow, I think it's fair to say that the statement anyone can enjoy this movie particularly applies to this one. By all accounts, this should have been a jump the shark bad movie, because I mean, you know, aliens, really? And yes, I'm aware that there was a TV episode that had aliens too, but a 5-minute episode isn't exactly a feature film, you know? Seeing that this was the direction they were going with Shaun made me initially wince, and yet somehow, this one's still pretty damn good. Wallace and Gromit, A Matter of Loaf and Death. I don't think anyone's surprised I put this lower than the other Wallace and Gromit movies. However, I still think this one's pretty good. The jokes and story are solid throughout, and Gromit continues to prove he has the persistence and patience of a saint, and when Paella faces Gromit for biting her and Wallace believes it, I felt actual anger on behalf of this pure character being done dirty like this. It's a notable style of the comedy of the Wallace and Gromit series, but man, the more you grow up, the more you bloody well hate the stuff that Gromit has to go through. With the humor, it's interesting how you can kind of tell this is a post-Curse of the Were-Rabbit movie. You know, Wallace and Gromit has always had that British wacky style of humor, but it switched to being much more overt and sometimes on the nose when it came to Were-Rabbit onwards. In the original 3 films, it's a lot more gentle and subtle in tone, and here you have a sequence of Wallace dancing the salsa. It's very much a little bit of an Americanized British story, you know? Or maybe it's us British audiences getting Americanized as well. Not to mention the amount of innuendo that's in these latter 2 movies. Woof. Regardless, what I really like in this one is that they reveal the murderer fairly early doors. Instead of making the point of this one is a murder mystery, they actually play on the fact that Gromit can't talk to Wallace. Having one of the protagonists fully aware of the situation whilst completely unable to communicate it to the other about it is just great writing, you know? I'd call into question the fact that Gromit can read but not write, but can draw a diagram of a bag inspector barrier and oh yeah, build that same bag inspection barrier? Like, couldn't he have just written out a full explanation? But yeah, hey, it's a film. It doesn't matter, you know? I do feel bad for Paella in the sense that she seems to lose absolutely everything because of her size, and that's kind of played for laughs, which is probably the element that makes this movie the most dated out of everything. That aside, I'd say she's still a very good calculating character. It may be the lowest ranked in the Wallace and Gromit pantheon, but I still think it's a good one nonetheless. So sandwiching around Wallace and Gromit, we have Shaun the Sheep, the movie. Just a heads up, I know this follows the typical TV characters movies take them to the big city trope that we've seen a million times over, not to mention the character bumps their head and loses their memory, chaos ensues trope storyline. However, this movie does both of those, I would say, very well. Particularly as the story never loses sight of the off-the-wall logic of the Shaun the Sheep series. The simple narrative is there is a vessel for Shaun and the gang to just do their thing, but this time in the city. Like Farmageddon, this can be watched by anyone from any culture and they'll get some enjoyment out of it. However, I think this one's strength over the sequel is that it keeps things even more simple. Instead of alien encounter, we just have the farmer wandering around after forgetting everything. And we have the other plot with the pest control guy tracking them down. And again, for more universal appeal, he's not as brutal as the exterminator from Over the Hedge or anything. However, he does try and push them off of a cliff edge in the climax, which would have seen him almost done for murder or manslaughter with the farmer in there too. So, he's still pretty bad. Outside of Were-Rabbit, there's not a lot of positivity for pest control guides in family movies. Anyway, as a feature-length adaptation of the Shaun the Sheep series, this does a really good job. In the modern day, it's really difficult to authentically resurrect silent comedy without looking like a gimmick. In the Shaun the Sheep movie, it never feels like a gimmick, it just makes sense. Whilst silent comedy may look a bit weird if done in modern live action, I think animation can definitely still do it justice, and this is a great example of that. And once again, it's the studio pushing the boundaries of animation and cinema as a whole, in a sense. Wallace and Gromit, A Grand Day Out. Oh boy, this is where I might start to upset some people. It is a good movie, don't worry, it's not bad to be this far low on the list at this point. As I said, the whole thing that this studio makes is pretty much good other than one movie. From here on in, these are all great movies. In fact, the reason some of the above movies are so great is because of the groundwork that this movie did. This is the one that Aardman have to thank for kicking off their golden era. However, compared to some of these later examples, this one is fairly simple story-wise. Like a lot of the Shaun the Sheep ones, this isn't a bad thing at all. It's also incredible when you consider that this was originally a student project that got way out of hand, as in, Nick Park was animating this completely by himself at art college before Aardman finally stepped in to help him finish it. In total, from student film to release, it took 6 years to complete. Going back 6 years prior to its 1989 release, just let that sink in that Nick Park has now directed the latest installment. He's been doing Wallace and Gromit for over 40 years, from when he was a student to now. And the film itself is just great. The off-the-wall idea of a guy who can't think of where to go on holiday, so decides the best option is to build a rocket to the moon so that he can restock on cheese. Like, who thinks of that kind of story? And I have to, of course, acknowledge the fan-favorite oven robot. He looks like an oven anyway. Is he meant to be a thing? Weirdly, once they reach the moon, it kind of becomes the robot story as well. And when you analyze it, you don't really learn a lot about Wallace and Gromit themselves in this one. Once the robot comes into the picture, the whole thing switches to the robot's perspective. It's quite a choice, but I'm glad they did it. It's just so weird that this is the first one. It's like if the pilot episode of The Simpsons was one of the episodes that followed one of the side characters. There's a timeline where this is the only Wallace and Gromit film they made, and we barely learned anything about them. And yet, Wallace's two trademark characteristics of ridiculous inventions and cheese were both established right here. As well as, thankfully, the decision that Gromit doesn't really work with a mouth, because early test footage shows that was also almost a reality. The Pirates in an Adventure with Scientists, or for its American subheading, Band of Misfits. Sorry, your corporate overlords clearly don't think you can handle the word scientists. Just like philosopher in Harry Potter. They did the same thing with using Sorcerer's Stone instead of the original Philosopher's Stone, so I'm sensing a theme. America thinks you Americans are dumb. Interesting. Anyway, the movie itself, this is arguably the most visually stunning Aardman film there is. The design work throughout is just something else. Whether the pirate island, the ship interiors, the ship exteriors, the Darwin mansion, there isn't one texture in this movie that hasn't received some degree of effort. As for the story itself, quite suitably, it is nuts! What starts as a traditional pirate story soon descends into an alternate history of Charles Darwin being a sellout wimp and Queen Victoria being part of a secret exotic animal-eating society who's also secretly a ninja who has a mechanical skirt that carries her swords. That's the plot. I don't know another studio that would have the balls to make a movie like this, you know? Laika could never. I know these are based off of some books as well, so I'm very intrigued to know if there's any other installments with plots this wild. And there's some great zany gags throughout. And yet more, how do they animate that in stop motion sequences? Like a bath riding through a mansion. You know, the usual stuff. There's not really any profound character moments, but if 100 gags in one movie is your forte, well, here you go. Add that a cast including Hugh Grant, David Tennant, Martin Freeman, Imelda Staunton, Brenda Gleeson, and Salma Hayek. Rogue addition to the cast, but they all worked fantastically for the movie. It doesn't make my top 5, but it's still a lot of fun, and maybe the best showcase of Aardman's technical ability as a stop-motion animation studio. flushed away. Now, there's either people who are going to be ecstatic that I've ranked this as high as it is, and some who are going to be straight up baffled. You wanted a British movie? Well, I've just done a proper split-the-room Brexit movie on this one. I've just ranked it above 2 Wallace and Gromit movies, including the original short. Not to mention, the movie I just said is the best showcase of Aardman's technical ability as a stop-motion animation studio. Okay, here we go. Flushed Away is admittedly a great movie, as much as I actually hated it when I first saw it as a kid. I just said how The Pirates is great for the snappy Aardman gags, and this has a joke in almost every single frame. Right from the opening in Roddy's house, the switch to CGI has not deterred Aardman's ability to hide detail in every shot. Particularly once you get down to the sewer version of London, there's just gags everywhere. It's definitely something that has repeat viewing value. I mean, I might even go on to say, it's the hot fuzz of animation on that front. Once again, the plot is just another showcase of the brains of Aardman are just wired differently. How do you get to a point where you think the climax should be a sewer flood caused by everyone going to the toilet at the same time during a World Cup football game? Now that's how you make a sports game have stakes, early man. Yes, it's kind of weird that they made all the characters look like they were hand-molded by Nick Park. It's definitely a choice, but this was their first proper trip out in CG animation. They had to prove that they wouldn't lose themselves in stop motion, and it's interesting to see the change in approach from the Oscars as well. Because I'm telling you, if they'd made this thing in claymation, it probably would have been nominated. But no, Cars got nominated over this. Anyway, this was of course the movie that ended with Aardman and DreamWorks falling out. At the time, the tabloid rumors suggested that DreamWorks were offended by the American tourist characters. However, you'd have to be a fool to think that this is why a major multi-million-dollar deal was cancelled. By this time, DreamWorks were doing pretty well with their own projects. In fact, much better than the stuff they were producing with Aardman. Even Chicken Run, still the highest grossing stop-motion movie of all time, was immediately dwarfed by Shrek's $500 million gross the subsequent year. Aardman were both not as profitable as their in-house movies, and due to the nature of the stop-motion beast, were fairly slow to produce the movies in the first place. Speedy money man DreamWorks just weren't gonna play ball with this kind of business model, despite being the ones who agreed to it in the first place. Nonetheless, I'm glad this movie gets some more appreciation now that our generation's grown up, myself included, because it deserves a great deal more credit than the failure that killed the DreamWorks relationship. Even just accounting for Bill Nighy's mouse character, this is ironically one of the funniest movies out there. Then you add in Ian McKellen's Toad, another great Aardman villain. Actually, seriously, they're consistently great villains. Hugh Jackman and Kate Winslet in the lead roles also work great together. Insert obligatory first appearance of Hugh Jackman in comic-accurate Wolverine costume mentioned here. Even the damn cockroach behind the stove made me laugh out loud, and I don't actually laugh that much in real life. The minion-coded slugs could be quite funny too. I could take them or leave them really, and with hindsight, that kind of makes sense. Unfortunately, they just couldn't make as much merch out of the slugs as minions, so whatever. Who'd have thought cute yellow Tic Tacs are more marketable than brown slugs? Anyway, this movie's great, and nowadays I'll probably actually defend it to the end. Wallace and Gromit, a close shave. Back to the dynamic duo, we have the first of the 3 Wallace romances, and arguably the best one. Mainly because I love that it falls apart because she can't have cheese. I swear Wallace is the only character where you totally get why he wouldn't go through with someone who doesn't eat the same food as him. Anyway, this is the one where we get to meet Sean for the first time as a Terminator cyberdog goes on a mission to turn him and his friends into dog meat. Funny, they never went back to doing anything that dark on the TV show. There's a lot of story beats in this one. The Gwendolyn romance, missing sheep, the scary looking dog that gave me actual nightmares as a kid, Sean's invasion of 62 West Wallaby Street, Wallace's sinister looking knitting machine, the fact that all of those end up connected, Gromit gets framed and put in prison, Gromit gets broken out of prison, the knitting machine becomes a mincing machine. We've come a long way from the Grand Day Out by this point. It's strange to think that 3 movies in, this was the first one to feature more than 3 characters, unless you factor in the mice from the Grand Day Out. Let alone the first with another human character. Alas, she looks more like Wallace's sister than his love interest, but let's not get into that. Apparently, Nick Park took some convincing too when it came to allowing characters to have more features beyond the same monobrow and wide smile as Wallace. And it's a good job that they had that chat when they did, because imagine if every character in Were-Rabbit was designed like that. Absolutely not, thank you. Anyway, as with many Aardman storylines, there's many wild places they go with this story, and somehow it comes together in a way that totally makes sense and is easy to follow. I mean, I could understand it from an early age, and it came out the year I was born, so there we go. Great film, accidentally started a whole new franchise, wish certain memes hadn't ruined my imagination when it comes to the opening porridge sequence. And I am still both impressed and horrified by the design of that cyberdog. Alright, let's talk about Creature Comforts, the rogue of the list. I know a whole series of them have followed, but the original film still deserves recognition. This was the short film that got Aardman their first Oscar, and for good reason. This was truly unique, animating to the audio from interviews of actual people. This being the first, the people being interviewed likely had no idea quite what was going on. Whilst a lot of comedies that do interviews with the public can often be mean-spirited and at their expense, this really feels like the opposite. I'd be charmed as hell if I found out that my interview was going to be turned into a talking tortoise. The jaguar frustrated with the UK's lack of meat is a particular highlight, as is the polar bear family, where clearly the kid just thought he could absolutely go to town with the interview. This beat Grande out to the Oscars, and it's kinda clear to see why. There's just nothing else like Creature Comforts, and if you think otherwise, just ask Incredibles director Brad Bird. He's apparently a big fan. As am I. So rolling on up to the other big boys, we of course now have Chicken Run. The first Aardman feature film, and somewhat sadly, still its most successful one. Maybe there really is a diminishing trajectory for the studio. This movie was absolutely groundbreaking. Up to this point, stop-motion movies were either fairly minor projects or huge flops like Nightmare Before Christmas. Besides, out of Aardman, I find that a lot of stop-motion films have a slightly creepy quality about them. I don't know why or how Aardman feels like an exception of that, but it's just an observation. Anyway, this was the first time that stop-motion and major box office success could be strung into the same sentence. And this success was also for good reason, as it's a great movie that people still quote to this day. I know you don't like Gravy. Unlike its sequel, it also has a consistent tone and vision of what they were going for with the story. They wanted a chicken farm to feel like a prisoner of war camp, and that's what they did. The color palette is desaturated other than the chickens themselves. Every step that a character treads has mud being picked up alongside with it. The fences, from the chicken's perspective, tower into the skies. They just absolutely smash that tone. The perspective is from the chickens, and that especially pays off for making the human antagonist feel like this giant, unforgiving, godly force. I think I heard that any shots with the chicken and humans together, the chickens were the size of Wallace and the humans were giant. I'd love to see a Mrs. Tweety puppet the size of someone's leg. And yeah, as mentioned earlier, I did a video a couple years back just on the scene where one chicken gets selected for the chop. It is one of the most harrowing animated sequences I have ever seen. And if you weren't fussed initially, you absolutely back the chickens escaping from that moment onwards. It's a real snap into action, and probably had all sorts of audiences suddenly lock in and pay attention when it occurs. The comedy hits as hard as it does because it's balanced with the genuine peril and threat of the chicken situation. And yes, it does get a bit Bugs Life-y and a million other storylines when Rocky is playing vague with whether he's a flying rooster or not, but like many story tropes Aardman tread over, they do still execute it very well. This was also very much the precursor to Were-Rabbit in terms of can Aardman do ensemble characters. The takeaway from this movie was they absolutely can. The ensemble of characters in this are truly brilliant, from the dodgy dealer rats, the old colonel, the Scotty-type techie character, and of course Babs. And beyond how big their models are, the villains here are also brilliant, as most Aardman villains are. I really gotta do a tier list of Aardman villains at this rate. The Tweeties are plucked straight out of a Roald Dahl book, and get that classic combination of hilarious and terrifying just right. This is the film credited with the subsequent introduction of Best Animated Feature, and it is easy to see why. Truly iconic status that is yet to be overthrown in the stop-motion business. So let's talk about Wallace and Gromit, The Curse of the Were-Rabbit finally. So here's another one a lot of people would disagree with. I've put this one above two of the original Wallace and Gromit shorts, as well as Chicken Run. And I don't care. I think this was a great adaptation of the iconic pair to a feature-length film, and they have the Oscar to prove it. They successfully upscaled the plot whilst keeping the trademark aesthetic of the franchise, which is essentially that of old-school thrillers. Not to mention the fact that they went from close shave with one other human character to this one with an entire village worth of of characters. The story justifies upscaling the ensemble like this, but we also get some great character moments out of it. Some of the best jokes come from the villagers, the vicar, the hunchback guy, the policeman who reveals the giant bald head under his helmet still. No, that's not an innuendo. And by the way, in case you hadn't heard, that police officer's back for the new one. As I've said earlier, the humor in this one definitely loses a layer of subtlety by this point, which can be a criticism of leaning to the American demographic, oh no. However, I think the humor still stays distinctively British, and you do need those bigger laughs in a bigger movie. And you know, this did go out in cinemas, so you kind of want those big laughs in the theater space. Beyond the expectedly high gag rate from Aardman, the story itself also hits all the right beats for a feature-length film, whilst also not failing to still be incredibly silly. It's about a giant rabbit stealing people's vegetables, people. It's incredibly silly. However, I don't know if this is because I was a kid at the time, but the twist reveal that Wallace was the were-rabbit absolutely took me off guard. My 8-year-old self did not spot the clues at all. I was a bit of a stupid kid. I did get hoodwinked in Hoodwinked. Nick Park pitched this as a horror movie suitable for kids, and I think that he absolutely pulled that off. I think for young children, that were-rabbit transformation sequence balances being creepy enough for kids whilst also being funny at the same time. This isn't on the same level as the trauma we all got from Monster House anyway. The villain, Victor Quartermain, is also entertaining throughout. He's completely versatile in being able to come across as a fool in some scenes, sinister in others, and downright nuts towards the end. Ray Fiennes clearly has a great time doing that role. Plus, his dog Philip is on hand for that awesome dogfight sequence in the climax. I mean, that scene was my jam. Not to mention the gag of pausing in the middle and he pulls out a little purse to get his money out. And of course, we have Wallace's second fancy in Lady Tottington, whose posh accent makes for some of the best jokes in the movie, plus seems to invite an ungodly amount of innuendo later on. My god, there are some cheeky moments in the movie. But even with all the bells and whistles of the expanded cast, it is still Gromit who is the most compelling part of this film. Despite not saying a word, we are very much following this movie from his perspective, and the character work on Gromit's animation is so good at communicating what he is thinking. If you want to know how much of the character is just the animation over the voice actor, just take a look at Gromit, who doesn't even have one. Everything we appreciate about this beloved character is done truly and purely through a small group of animators moving him frame by frame. It may be Wallace's transformation crisis in the center of this plot, but make no mistake that this is Gromit's movie, and it is all the better for it. But it can still be topped, as we've got to talk about Wallace and Gromit: The Wrong Trousers. My highest ranking Wallace and Gromit film, as I think it is for many people. A Grand Day Out may have set the table, but this was the one where I think people really bought into these two characters. It was certainly the film that showed what kind of story you could tell with them, with a conscious homage to Alfred Hitchcock's thrillers, using a penguin who disguises himself as a chicken. Okay. I think the recent media buzz about this penguin's return, Feathers McGraw, for those who didn't know, in the upcoming Vengeance Most Foul, is clear how much of an impact this particular film had. Again, as I've said with Gromit, the main villain never says a word and comes up to your knee, yet immediately comes across as 100 times more threatening than half of the Disney rogues gallery. Those beady eyes, those still vacant stares come across as far more evil than anything he actually does. It's hard to explain. And it's not just the penguin, this remains the gold standard for the studio. From Wallace's grand entrance for breakfast to the famous final train chase, the invention of the animation set pieces is also just incredible. There doesn't seem to be an ounce of, we did it like that because that was easier. For what was such a small studio at the time, the ambition is self-evident. It's no surprise that DreamWorks stepped in years later to work with them, as this film showed the cinematic ambition of Aardman and what they are truly capable of. Particularly when you account for there only being 3 characters throughout, and only one being able to speak. Some may argue that the Wrong Trousers themselves becomes a character, particularly when it runs away in a bin later on. Nah, I disagree. Anyway, this is the crown jewel of the Aardman fleet, the film that arguably cemented all other projects that followed it and the studio's success. Absolutely mastering the appeal of individual characters, with Feathers McGraw clearly being one of the most sinister villains of all time in animation. And the fact that he just silently comes out with an actual realistic gun is so far and away from the usual Wallace and Gromit tone. There are guns later, sure, but they're like hunter's rifles for pests. It's still wild to see in hindsight after all the context of the rest of the franchise and what Aardman covers. Can't wait to see him again in the next Netflix movie. Ever since 1993, it still remains the best stop-motion movie that Aardman has ever done. But we're not done with this video yet, because I want to talk about Arthur Christmas. Well, this certainly feels blasphemous. The world's most famous stop-motion animation studio, and I've put one of their only CGI movies at the top of the list. Hey, I'm just a guy. I have no credits in actually being a reviewer. A lot of people will hate this, maybe even more than the flushed away ranking. I'm sorry, I can't help myself. I've just got to go with my preferences here. This is just straight up one of my favorite movies. You know how sometimes you can kind of separate your favorite Christmas movies from the movies you think are actually good? Not necessary here, this is just a great movie. And besides not having the claymation they're best known for, all of the other Aardman trademarks are still alive and well. The hyper-paced gag rate, the quintessentially British characters in the central Santa family, it's all there. Undoubtedly, The Incredibles is one of the all-time best animated portrayals of a family dynamic. I don't think many would disagree. However, Arthur Christmas offers something very different. In this movie, we get to see a family that is slightly older with two young adult sons and aging parents. In many ways, it's a nicer version of Succession, but with Santa. Here, he just has to retire. No one has to die for this Santa ascendancy. And thank God, because Grand Santa is the best character in this film. Between him and the flushed away mouse, Bill Nighy is the GOAT of Aardman voice actors. The first couple times I watched Arthur Christmas, I didn't even know it was him. I've honestly never seen a better encapsulation of that older generation, both in terms of their back-to-front sense of humor, but also what grows into a genuinely empathetic take on why people of a certain generation hang on to their values like they do. One of the best scenes, at a point where it seems all hope is lost, sees Grand Santa explain why he wanted to prove things were better in his day. Because he feels like he's lost who he used to be and wants to remind the rest of the family of what he once was. And that's just one story beat in this movie. Each family member has a clearly defined motive that anyone can relate to. Obviously, Grand Santa wanting validation of his glory days. You have the current Santa, Malcolm, who's now clearly at a point where he's expected to retire because for whatever reason, literally the biggest job in the world is tiring for a 90-plus-year-old man. However, he doesn't want to let it go because he is scared in the face of retirement and losing his life as Santa, which, in turn, Grand Santa's motivation also helps to accentuate why he would also feel like that. You have Mrs. Claus, who basically runs the family without much acknowledgement, who wants to have Malcolm retire as he is visibly overworking, which is stopping them from having any quality time together. You know, the dude's just too tired to even wrap his own family's presents. You have Steve, the disciplined capitalist tech douche. In other hands, they wouldn't have given this character any redemption or sympathy. However, Aardman, both showing his uglier side at his expense, whilst also ultimately letting the audience in on why he is how he is. You can see that he is running the whole operation while his dad still gets all the credit. In the emotional climax where Malcolm tells Steve that he deserves to be Santa, the one in-breath he does perfectly accentuates how much it means to him. However, what is also clear is that he's got so locked into the logistical operation that he's pretty much forgotten why Santa exists in the first place. Which is when we get to Arthur. Grand Santa has the nostalgia of Santa, Malcolm has the traditional look of Santa, and Steve has the logistical know-how to make Santa possible. But Arthur is the one who still has sight on what it means to be Santa. And that is the real genius of Arthur Christmas. It is a great movie for kids and very much fulfills its surface-level mandate of explaining how Santa does it. Easily is one of the best interpretations of the Santa mythos, and that's only one of its goals, as it also gives a great message to parents. It doesn't matter how it got there, if the present's there on Christmas morning, then Santa came. It's a message that all the Christmas fluff tries to get across, but none of them have nailed it as well as this. That's why Arthur Christmas is beyond just being a Christmas movie, and genuinely an excellent film in its own right. It's also probably why it's underappreciated. I'm still gutted that it didn't do big numbers when it came out. Not even a toe-curling version of Santa is Coming to Town by Justin Bieber was able to boost it at the time. However, I'm glad that it does get more recognition every year, and being a Christmas movie, it has that innate replayability which will hopefully just continue to help grow a wider appreciation of it. Ironic and blasphemous, I know, to put it at the very top of a studio ranking about stop-motion animation and being overly British, and then just to put it down to a Santa story, but hey, my opinions can be flawed sometimes. And that is my big Aardman ranking. I have no doubt that this looks completely different to your list, but of course, this was a list that is in order of what I personally like, not necessarily what is objectively the best. I'm also sure I've missed all sorts of other short films. I know there's some Shaun the Sheep short films not part of the main series, but let's be honest, there is way too much Shaun the Sheep content to cover. So we'll end this already pretty long video before it gets any further. I mean, my recording's already over an hour, so that certainly says enough. Nonetheless, for now, my name's been Daz. Thank you very much for reaching the end of this video. Why don't you give out your own rankings on the comments down below? I'd love to see all of your different lists. You can also do it on our Discord server if you'd like. And I'll probably get back to you with another ranking video sometime next week. Otherwise, I shall see you in a little bit.